She abandoned her daughter after a suicide attempt. I took her in. Now I'm her real mom. This isn't some Hollywood script. This isn't a best-selling novel. This is real, a truth so raw it shook every family column across America. And they kept reposting it for an entire year, 2004. Who gives birth, who stays when the child needs someone most? 2 women. Locked in a brutal, unrelenting battle that lasted 18 months. Not for money, not for fame, but for one impossible question. Who is the real mother? I spent a month checking facts, and chasing down every piece of this story. And now, it's time I tell you the truth. Rachel Miller was a high school English teacher living in a small town in Oregon. At 40, she didn't have many friends. But Natalie Clark, she was the opposite. They met back in college in a liberal arts philosophy class when both were still young, still hopeful. Natalie was stylish, ambitious, always dreaming of having children. Rachel quiet, reserved, careful. And yet somehow, they fit. 2 puzzle pieces from different boxes, but perfectly aligned. When Zoe, Natalie's daughter, was born after a brief failed marriage, Rachel was the first to hold the baby. Her hands still smelled of cheap coffee from the rundown apartment she rented back then. 3 years later, when Rachel had her own daughter, Lily, they raised their girls together, like sisters. The 2 mothers lived just a few blocks apart. They took turns with pickups and drop-offs. They shared dinners. They shared daycare bills. They shared life and all the tiny, messy, beautiful worries that came with it. To most people, it looked like a simple friendship. But to Rachel, Natalie was family. Not the kind you're born into, the kind you choose. Natalie called at 2 a.m., her voice bubbling with excitement. I'm going to Bali for a week. Meditation retreat detox for my soul and my skin, she said, laughing. Can Zoe stay with you? The girls still get along, right? Rachel hesitated. But in the end, she said yes. She trusted Zoe, the 15-year-old who still felt like that sweet little girl. And it was only a week. What could possibly go wrong? The first 3 days were peaceful. Lily and Zoe watched Netflix, munched on snacks, giggled under the blankets just like old times. But on the 3rd night, Zoe didn't come down for dinner. Rachel called out. No answer. She walked to the door and knocked. Still nothing. She called Zoe's name again, then tried the doorknob. Locked. Something inside her shifted, a cold panic crawling up her spine. She rushed to the kitchen, pulled open the drawer, grabbed the spare key. When she opened the door, time stopped. Zoe lay on the bed, pale, still, eyes closed. Next to her, an empty blister pack of pills. And on the pillow, a folded note. Rachel couldn't feel her own breath. She only heard the pounding in her ears, her heart screaming. Rachel didn't even remember how she called 911. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't press the first number right. When the paramedics rolled Zoe onto the stretcher, Rachel grabbed the girl's hand, whispering, "You're gonna be okay," even though her mind was blank. None of this felt real. Inside the ambulance, she clutched her phone. There was only one thing she could do. Call Natalie. It rang 3 times. On the other end, waves crashing, soft background music. "What's going on?" Natalie asked, her voice lazy like she'd just woken up from a spa nap. "It's Zoe," Rachel said, her voice tight. She might have taken something. "We're on the way to the hospital." A pause. Then Natalie's voice so soft, Rachel thought she misheard. "Is it that serious? Maybe she just wants attention." Rachel froze. She didn't know what hurt more, seeing Zoe lying still on that bed, or hearing her mother treat it like just some teenage drama. The texts that followed. Cold. Cruel. Changing flights costs $200. The nurse will take care of it. Don't overreact. teens do this stuff. Rachel read each word like it was slicing into her skin. One cut at a time. And in that strange, heavy silence, a truth finally surfaced. A truth she had refused to admit for years. Natalie had stopped being a mother long ago. Not in Bali. Not when the plane took off. But in those everyday moments, when Zoe had stomach cramps and still walked to school alone. When Rachel sat through every parent-teacher meeting, while Natalie sent a bouquet and a texted apology. It was brutal. It was heartbreaking. But it was clear. And there was no going back. Zoe survived. The doctors called it a miracle. If you'd found her just a few minutes later, they said we couldn't have saved her. Rachel took a leave from school the very next day. She practically camped by Zoe's bedside for an entire week. Every morning she wiped Zoe's face with a warm cloth. Every night she read aloud from her favorite books, even if she wasn't sure Zoe could hear a word. But Rachel didn't care. She was there when Zoe opened her eyes and whispered, "You're still here. You still have a chance." On the 8th day, Natalie came back. She walked into the house wearing wedge espadrilles, hauling a designer suitcase, tanned skin, glowing, smiling like she'd just finished filming a sunscreen commercial. Rachel was sorting Zoe's medications when she heard Natalie's first words. "Where should I put my luggage?" Not a single question about her daughter. Rachel tried to stay calm. She pointed toward the bedroom, said Zoe was resting, and gently brought up the treatment plan, a long-term therapy course the doctors recommended, set to begin the following week. "I've already spoken to a therapist," Rachel explained softly. "They specialize in adolescence. And, are you trying to be her mom now?" Natalie snapped, her voice sharp. Rachel stood up. "I'm not trying to take anything. She's faking it," Natalie shouted. "She knows I'd feel guilty. She wants me to blame myself. This whole thing, it's just a stunt for attention. She gets that from her father, always finding ways to make people feel bad for him." Her scream echoed through the house. And then silence. Zoe was standing in the doorway, wearing her oversized hospital robe, hair-tangled bruises still faint under her eyes. She said nothing. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She just looked at her mother and cried. No sound. No blame. Just tears, as if the disappointment inside her had finally found a way out. Natalie turned, saw her daughter, and froze. No hug. No apology. Not even a step forward. Rachel walked to Zoe, wrapped her arms around her, and for the first time, Zoe leaned in. Not to her mother, but to someone who chose her. Zoe didn't say a single word to her mother that entire day. She locked her bedroom door, only opened it when Rachel knocked gently, bringing in a bowl of soup and the prescribed medication. All evening, Zoe sat curled up in the corner of the bed, knees pulled to her chest, eyes staring off as if watching the world from somewhere far, far away. When Rachel asked, "If you want, I can stay with you tonight," Zoe just nodded. Barely. Like a breath. The next morning, Natalie was gone. No note, no text, nothing. Rachel assumed she just needed space. Time to process. But by noon, the police knocked on the door. A young officer stood on the porch, polite but firm. "We received a call reporting the unlawful detainment of a minor. Ms. Natalie Clark claims her daughter is being held here against her will." Rachel froze. Her heart dropped. But she took a deep breath and invited them in. Zoe was at the dining table, hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, like it was the last comforting thing she had left. The officer asked, "Do you want to go home with your mother?" Zoe shook her head. No trembling, no hesitation. Rachel calmly handed over the hospital discharge papers, listing her as Zoe's temporary guardian, along with a doctor's note, declaring Zoe's mental state unstable and needing supervised recovery. The officer frowned. We'll contact CPS Child Protective Services. They'll decide the next steps. 2 hours later, a CPS worker arrived. High ponytail, gray raincoat, a face that showed no judgment. She spoke with Rachel first, then sat down with Zoe in the living room. Almost an hour passed. Rachel could only make out fragments. Where do you feel safer? Has your mother ever done anything that scared you? When it ended, the woman stood, flipped open her notepad, and said clearly, Based on today's observations and interviews, I'm recommending Zoe remain in Ms. Rachel's home under a 72-hour safety watch. During this period, her biological mother is not permitted private contact without a third-party supervisor present. This is standard protocol in cases with potential psychological risk to a minor. Silence. Natalie, who had just walked in after getting word from the police, froze in the hallway. She wore a flowing white maxi dress, wooden bangles from her retreat still on her wrist. Are you people kidding me? I'm her mother. She's my daughter. The caseworker stayed calm. We understand that. But right now, Zoe's emotional safety is our top priority. Natalie turned on Rachel. What do you want? You want to raise her now? You trying to turn my kid into your kid? Rachel didn't flinch. She placed her hand gently on Zoe's shoulder. So light. It barely touched her. No one's trying to take anyone, Natalie. You're just slowly losing something you never really held on to. For the first time since she came back, Natalie said nothing, not out of guilt, not out of regret, just because she had nothing left to say. 3 days passed, like moving through thick fog, quiet, tense, filled with unspoken questions. Zoe stayed at Rachel's home, sleeping in what used to be Lily's room, eating toast with honey for breakfast, learning how to normalize a life that had never truly been whole. On the final night of the 72-hour safety watch, Rachel was folding laundry when Zoe slowly approached. She held a faded pink phone in her hand, chipped, paint-scuffed edges, the one Rachel assumed had been lost at the hospital. I want to show you something, Zoe said softly. But her voice was steady. The screen lit up with a text conversation between Natalie and someone named Jessa Wish. There was a way to ditch my kid without getting judged, or at least make her disappear for a while without it falling back on me. I'm so tired. Rachel stared at the screen. How long have you known? She asked gently. Before everything happened, Zoe whispered. But I thought she was joking. Neither of them said the word suicide, but it lingered heavy in the air, like smoke after a fire. Rachel said nothing, but inside she knew this moment changed everything. The next day she forwarded the screenshots to CPS along with Zoe's written statement. It didn't take long for everything to explode. Natalie didn't stay quiet. She went on the offensive. She hired a lawyer, filed a complaint accusing Rachel of obsessing over my daughter, manipulating her into turning against me, and fabricating lies to steal custody. On social media, Natalie posted an old photo of her, and Zoe captioned with syrupy sweetness, "Nothing replaces a mother's love unless someone tries to turn your child into theirs." Public opinion mixed. Some of Natalie's relatives reposted the photo voicing support. But then CPS launched a formal investigation. They spoke with Zoe's doctor, with her homeroom teacher, with neighbors who remembered late-night drop-offs when Rachel brought Zoe home and Natalie was nowhere in sight. And slowly, a picture began to form. No caption could hide it now. The English teacher, the one who had tried calling Natalie during a parent meeting only to get a text back saying, "Getting my nails done. Don't call now," wrote a 3-page statement. Zoe's therapist confirmed. She shows prolonged signs of depression stemming from emotional neglect by her biological mother. She's found safety and stability with Ms. Rachel, the only adult consistently responsive to her needs. And the screenshots Zoe had kept became the final key. The first court hearing was held behind closed doors. A family court judge listened to both sides. Natalie sat with arms crossed, mascara smeared from crocodile tears. Rachel sat beside a public defender, not frantic, just calm, just honest. When asked, "What do you think about Zoe's current relationship with her mother?" Rachel replied plainly, "I don't think, I just watch. And what I see is a child who fears her mother more than she misses her." Then came Zoe's turn. She took a deep breath. "I don't hate my mom," she said. "I just don't feel like she ever really wanted me to exist." After deliberation, the judge ruled Natalie's visitation. Rights would be limited, a maximum of 2 hours per week, with supervised contact only. And if she wished to regain any parental rights, she'd have to complete 6 months of mandatory psychological counseling. Rachel didn't celebrate. No one wins in courtrooms like this. But as they walked down the courthouse steps, Zoe slipped her hand into Rachel's and whispered, "I don't know what happens next, but if I could choose, I'd still choose to stay with you." For the first time, Rachel's heart felt still, not because she'd taken someone's place, but because finally she was exactly where she belonged. A week before the second hearing, Natalie played her final card, Zoe's biological father. She told the court that Daniel Reed, the man who signed Zoe's birth certificate, but vanished when she was just 4, had reconnected. And according to Natalie, he wants to be involved in her upbringing, so any custody decision must include him. A tactic, a clear attempt to delay the hearing and claw back some of the power she'd lost. Rachel heard the news from her lawyer, and it hit her like a splash of ice water. She had never met anyone named Daniel Reed, only heard of him once years ago in passing when Natalie muttered he was a mistake, not worth mentioning. But Zoe recognized the name, and the moment she heard it, her shoulders tensed, her eyes shifted guarded. "I don't remember his face," Zoe said, "just his voice. He used to read me bedtime stories. And then, he disappeared." Rachel felt something she couldn't name. Not suspicion, not trust either. Something in between. So she started digging. 3 days later, she found him. Daniel Reed, living in Spokane, nearly 6 hours away, working as a carpenter at a small wood shop. No social media, no recent photos. Just a quiet man with scruffy facial hair and tired eyes. But the moment Rachel introduced herself, Daniel stood up fast. "Zoe," he said, breathless. "Is she okay? I've been trying to find her for years." They sat in a tiny cafe. Daniel pulled out his wallet and unfolded a stack of old letters, everyone addressed to Zoe, sent to Natalie's last known address. All of them returned. He showed Rachel screenshots of emails sent to the address Natalie once used. No replies. He even had a petition filed when Zoe was 7, a request for visitation denied after Natalie changed her number, moved homes, and cut all contact. "I didn't abandon her," Daniel said. "I was erased." Rachel said nothing, but inside she burned. Not with sympathy, with anger. Anger for Zoe. For the years she grew up believing her father walked away, when the truth was he never stopped searching. She asked one last question, if you had a chance to see her again. What would you want? Daniel didn't hesitate, just for her to know. "I never stopped thinking about her. I don't want to take anything. I just want the right to be called her father, if she'll let me." Rachel handed him the court address, told him the date of the next hearing. The day Daniel walked into court, Zoe was sitting beside Rachel, hands trembling slightly. But when she looked up and saw him, no polished suit, no smug grin, just a wrinkled shirt and eyes full of emotion. Something in Zoe softened. Daniel didn't rush toward her, didn't reach out. He placed a letter on the table. "For you, if you want to read it." Zoe looked at the letter, then at him. And for the first time, she cried. No fear, no rage, just tears from a child who had finally realized she was never truly abandoned. The judge asked Mr. Reed, "Are you seeking custody?" Daniel shook his head. "No, Your Honor. I just want to be her father, even if I'm just a figure standing outside the door, as long as she knows I'm still there." No one in the courtroom said a word, not for a long moment. Rachel looked at Zoe, who now sat holding the letter, lips moving silently, reading slowly, as if she didn't want to miss a single word. Then, Zoe turned to the judge. "I want everything to stay as it is. But, if I can, I'd like to see my dad. Every weekend." The judge nodded. Daniel nodded. And Rachel, for the first time in weeks, smiled. A real smile. Because in a story filled with custody battles and broken trust, there was still space for the quiet arrival of someone not here to fight, but to love. 3 weeks after the final hearing, the court made it official. Rachel was granted temporary guardianship of Zoe, effective until a final custody ruling. Natalie's contact was restricted no more than 2 supervised visits per week at fixed hours with a court-assigned social worker present. Zoe didn't cheer. She didn't cry either. She simply exhaled like the noise of the past had finally faded into a whisper. Still there, still audible, but no longer drowning out the quiet shape of a new life. Rachel repainted Zoe's room in a soft cream color, replaced the desk lamp, added a new bookshelf. She didn't talk about the future, didn't call Zoe my daughter, didn't force anything. Each morning she brewed peppermint tea and left it by the study table. Each night they watched an old sitcom together. It was slow, but it was real. But Natalie wouldn't stop. Unwilling to accept what she called a public humiliation, she launched a new campaign, this time online. A Facebook group suddenly appeared, Justice for a Mother Who Lost Her Child. The profile photo, Natalie smiling beside Zoe, taken back when she was still in elementary school. The group's description painted Natalie as the victim of an obsessed teacher, a mother punished for trusting the wrong person. Worse still, she posted a photo of Zoe in the hospital, pale eyes shut, IV in her arm. The post didn't name her, but it didn't have to. And in the comments, strangers attacked Rachel. They called her a brainwasher, a thief. They said, no real mother could be that bad. Rachel found out when a coworker sent her the link along with a warning. You need to be careful. This is getting out of control. She didn't tell Zoe, but that night she couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the kitchen watching her tea go cold, listening to the wind rattle the windows. She thought about Natalie's smile, how charming it used to be, how once it had convinced her she'd found the best friend she could ever ask for. The next morning, Rachel reported everything to her lawyer. The court launched an emergency investigation. It didn't take long. Facebook released the IP data confirming Natalie had created and managed the group. Posting a photo of Zoe in a medical crisis without the consent of her legal guardian was a serious breach of a minor's right to privacy. Natalie was charged with 3 counts: defamation and harm against a legal guardian, intentional harassment of a minor, unauthorized distribution of private medical imagery. She was ordered to delete all content, shut down the group, attend 8 weeks of court-mandated behavioral therapy. From now on, every visit with Zoe would also require a court-assigned security officer present. One more violation, and her visitation rights would be permanently revoked. Zoe heard about it while doing the dishes. She didn't ask for details. She just set the glass down, turned to Rachel, and with quiet exhaustion asked, "Did Mom know about this?" The first time she called Natalie Mom again, but with distance in her voice. Rachel nodded. Yes. Zoe said nothing more. She stood there, then walked to her room. That night, Rachel found a small folded note on Zoe's desk. One line, written in pencil. I'm not choosing someone to replace someone else. I'm choosing the one who makes me feel like I matter. Rachel read it over and over until the sun came up. And when it did, she placed the note in a picture frame right beside the photo from Lily's birthday. 3 years ago, the one with Rachel and Zoe smiling side by side. Not to show it off, but to remind herself, some rescues are just the beginning. But being chosen, that's what truly matters. Life didn't magically transform after the final ruling, but it began to heal bit by bit. Zoe started therapy once a week. Her new therapist was a middle-aged woman with a calm voice and patient eyes. They didn't speak much at first, but slowly, Zoe began to open up. She spoke about old dreams, about mornings she had to put on her elementary school uniform by herself while her mother slept, and about the one time Natalie ever hugged her just before taking a photo to post on Facebook. Rachel never sat in on those sessions. She waited outside, book in hand, rarely making it past 2 pages because her mind kept drifting. But every time Zoe walked out standing a little straighter, smiling just a little softer, Rachel knew that was enough. Zoe also went back to school, not the old one. Rachel had enrolled her in a new place where no one knew her story. Zoe made new friends, joined a student film club, even signed up for Saturday art classes. She didn't talk much, but she no longer avoided eye contact. It was the kind of quiet victory Rachel had never dared to dream of. But Natalie still wouldn't disappear. Despite the no-contact order, she began sending anonymous letters, handwritten, unsigned, laced with guilt blame, even threats. Sometimes a folded note slid under the welcome mat. Other times, an untraceable message to Zoe's new phone. Rachel gathered everything and turned it over to the court. The no-contact order was extended. But then, on a rainy night in early September, Natalie did more than just send a letter. She drove to Rachel's house. Her car sat quietly in the dark, headlights off, but the front porch security camera recorded everything. She stepped out holding an envelope and a bottle of wine. She didn't knock. She just stood there, trembling, murmuring something no one could hear. Then sat down on the steps like a soul completely lost. Rachel called the police. Natalie was arrested on the spot for violating a court-issued no-contact order with a minor and on grounds of harassment and potential risk to safety. At a brief hearing that followed, a forensic psychologist was assigned to evaluate her. 3 weeks later, the report came back, narcissistic personality disorder. It wasn't a surprise, but it was the first time all the scattered pieces had a name: the obsession with control, the power games, the absence of empathy. The court ruled Natalie was barred from contacting Zoe in any form for 5 years. No letters, no texts, no in-person attempts. If she wished to request a reduction after 3 years, she would need to complete intensive therapy and submit regular psychological evaluations. Zoe didn't cry when she heard. She just exhaled and said to Rachel calmly, "For the first time, it feels like something's really over." Rachel said nothing, because she knew that didn't mean the pain was gone, just that it no longer controlled everything. And for a child who once believed she was a burden, that feeling, choosing safety over blood, was the true beginning of a new life. 3 years later, Zoe received her acceptance letter from a prestigious art school in Portland, with a full scholarship to study children's book illustration. That night, she hugged Rachel, shaking slightly, like she did on her first night in this house, but her eyes no longer held fear. The essay that won her the scholarship was titled, "The Place Where I Was Truly Seen." There was one line that made Rachel cry harder than she had in years. "My biological mother didn't love me. She loved the image of an ideal child she could show off. But in Rachel's home, I learned that love isn't something you earn by being good or convenient. It's something that holds you even when you're silent, broken, or messy. Rachel didn't try to hold Zoe back. On the morning of her departure, she stood at the curb with Daniel and Lily, watching Zoe load her suitcase onto the bus. They weren't a perfect family, but they were a chosen one, built on patience, kindness, and a kind of love that asked for nothing in return.